Uh, Welcome to class. We are going to be in lesson 8, and we're going to talk about the connections between Jesus and Joshua and Samuel. I'll say more about that here momentarily, but we're going to begin with a prayer. So let's bow, and Luke is going to lead us in prayer, and then we'll get into our study for this morning.
Dear God, thank you for this day and all the many wonderful blessings you've given us. Thank you for allowing us all to come here this morning to learn more about you. Pray all those who prepared classes will have their thoughts straight and help us to keep our minds on you, and pray for all those who are unable to come this morning, whatever it may be. We'll be able to come at the next appointed time. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Luke. All right, so Jesus and Joshua and Samuel. I'm going to ask you a little bit more momentarily about the place of Joshua and Samuel in the Old Testament narrative. Of course, you probably noticed that the way the book is organized is essentially chronological, that the comparisons between Jesus and certain Old Testament characters, we're following them through the Old Testament linearly, which makes sense. But one of the things that I think is important about that is that we start to see very clearly this idea that at every point in the Old Testament narrative, there are glimpses of Jesus. There's never really a time in Israel's history where we're not going to be reminded of something or pointed in some way to Jesus himself. And a lot of times, as we've seen, those connections are direct parallels, comparisons, and contrasts with leading characters in the Old Testament. Sometimes it's connections to themes in the Old Testament, to festivals, to laws, different things like that. But I think the point of it is, and the significance of that is just that at every step along Israel's way, really the ultimate solution to the problems that they were facing at any time, at any given moment, the ultimate solution to that is what Jesus was going to accomplish when he came in the flesh. And I think that in many ways that should help us practically, even though we're not in Israel's shoes, we're not going through some of the exact same things and circumstances that they went through. Scripture goes to great lengths to point out that we're not really tempted in any ways that are different from their temptations. That all temptation is common to mankind. And so the things that were challenging for Israel are the same kinds of things that are challenges for us today. No matter the culture or the time, temptation comes in the same general form. And so what that should give us confidence of is that there's never going to be something that we come across in our lives that Jesus is not going to be equipped to help us through. He is the perfect solution and the perfect example for anything and everything that we'll ever encounter. And I think that's one of the things that becomes clear and is really valuable about a systematic study like this, that no matter what page of the Old Testament we turn to, what book we're talking about, we're going to see glimpses of Jesus there. So I just wanted to start out by saying that because perhaps Joshua and Samuel are not as clear in terms of their connections to Jesus, or at least at the top of the list of characters that we would connect to him, although I think there are some strong connections, as we'll see. So let's talk about the places of Joshua and Samuel respectively in the Old Testament narrative. What would you say, let's start with Joshua first and then talk about Samuel. What would you say is the significance of Joshua in the Old Testament? Like, what role does he play? What's the importance of the timing of his arrival on the scene and how God uses him? What are some of the things that come to mind when you think of Joshua? Tanya? Okay, good. So a leader of great significance. If you were to come up with kind of a short list of prominent leaders throughout the Old Testament Not just prominent in terms of what they accomplished, but prominent in terms of their integrity. Joshua's got to be on that list. I mean, you've got Moses, certainly, David, some of the kings of Judah that were noble. But Joshua really stands out for a number of reasons, and one of them is his leadership. Very good. What else, without giving anything else away, what else is significant about Joshua's role in the Old Testament? Phil?
We've been studying Timothy, and I think Moses was the one that mentored Joshua, and then he took over leadership. He learned a lot of his leadership from Moses, most likely, but he's also one of the two spies who went in and led a positive report.
Good. So part of the value of Joshua is we have a little bit of a prolonged detail about his life, like his origin story. We find out how he comes to prominence as a helper to Moses, as one of the 12 who was chosen to go and spy out the land, one of the only two who was faithful in their duties. And then as a result of that, he comes to prominence and takes essentially the role, or a similar role to the one that Moses filled. But at a different time, a time where he's actually taking them into the land, and God is completing the promise that he made to give a land to his people. Good. Anita?
I was just going to say, he was there outside. He was with Moses when, he went up on the mountain. He didn't know what the people were doing down on the level ground.
Okay, good. So we really do get a connection about the closeness between Moses and Joshua. Joshua was, in about every sense of the word, Moses' right-hand man. And so that serves as a key bridge from the generation that dies off in the wilderness that included Moses to the generation that's now going to go into the promised land and is going to face a very different set of challenges than the challenges of the wilderness. It was important for them to have leadership to guide them through that. We know historically that there were ways that they didn't entirely succeed when they went into the land, but it wasn't because of a lack of leadership on Joshua's part. What are some other things about Joshua in terms of the role that he played and his significance in the Old Testament? Bruce? Good. So he comes along at a very important time for that reason, because really when you zoom out and look at the history of God's people, they've never really had rest. I mean, from the time that God calls Abram out of Ur, he's constantly on the move. He never has a place to really lay his head or territory to call his own. He's a sojourner for his whole life. As his family begins to grow and spread, they are the same. They live the same kind of nomadic lifestyle, even as they go down into Egypt and settle there. It's not long before they don't find rest in Egypt because Pharaoh enslaves them. So for the first time really in their history, there's someone who's going to bring them into a place where they're gonna finally be at peace and they're gonna have rest, at least for some time. Very good. Anything else about the significance of Joshua? How about Samuel? What would you say about the significance of Samuel in terms of the Old Testament narrative? Why is his a place of importance? Anita?
He was committed to God from his birth.
Okay, good. So you have somebody who, and really you could almost even say before that, prior to his birth, you have somebody who wasn't like recruited, partway through his life, or even early on in his life. You have somebody who from the get-go was dedicated to God, and somebody who fulfills that purpose really quite admirably throughout his life. Phil?
Yeah, we just talked about a bridge. He was the bridge between the judges and the kings.
Good.
Anointed.
Good. Yeah, so Samuel plays a significant role in connecting those two time periods or those generations. The time of the judges where there wasn't a king in Israel and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And yet, in that time period, God still had people that he sent to speak on his behalf, to try to guide the people and help them, lead them to him. So to bridge from that generation to the generation that wanted a king, and that God allowed to be given a king, and Samuel was was one of the ones, really the main one that God used to try to make sure that transition was a godly one. Very good. Bruce and Alan.
Well, in the same way, Jesus would be a transition from the old to the new.
Good.
And making that transition, which was difficult at best, as it was even with Samuel.
Good. And we'll talk more about that, the connection to Jesus here as we go through the study questions as well. Alan?
Samuel was not only a bridge to the kings, he was a bridge as far as prophets are concerned. Peter pointed out in Acts 3, which comes up in the lesson, obviously, that talks about that Moses, of course, spoke about Jesus, but then Samuel and the prophets. And so the word of God is infrequent in those days. It says, as far as God speaking to anyone in Israel as a prophet, but then Samuel was called to be a prophet, sort of the next major one after Moses, and then leading up, then after him, other prophets that follow.
Good. And of course, you have all of this happening, the prophetic role of Samuel, as well as being a judge and other things. You have all of that happening at a time when there were people who were trying to take authority for themselves, or who were sort of in competition with God's chosen rulers. And so in some ways, that's reflective of what the scene was like when Jesus came as well. Someone who is chosen by God to be a prophet, to be a judge, to the exclusion of all other self-proclaimed prophets and judges. And so part of what we're going to try to think about is what we learned from people like Joshua and Samuel about why it's so important that we pay such careful attention to Jesus. We talked about that a little bit last week with Moses as a prophet. But I think that theme continues with Joshua and Samuel as well. So let's look at some points of comparison between the two. In terms of the layout of the lesson, this one I think is fairly user-friendly because you have a number of texts that are laid out for you on pages 42 and 43 in your book that give you the specific references to look for comparisons. So we'll work our way through that. You probably found some other comparisons and contrasts as well. So feel free to share those. But working our way through this chart, what are some of the comparisons that you found between Joshua and Jesus? Tanya?
Well, that very first one, I guess I never realized that Joshua's name meant deliverance. God is deliverance.
Okay.
And Jesus' name I knew was God is salvation, but I never made the connection with Joshua's name.
Good. Yeah, and I don't know why. I mean, I kind of remember a similar thing. Like, you learn about Joshua pretty early on in Bible class. And maybe my teachers told me that and I just forgot. But it is one of those things that's pretty remarkable. I mean, right off the bat, if you look at the language, Joshua and Jesus are essentially the same name. That means, or it means some variation of Yahweh is salvation, or Jehovah is salvation. So right away, both of them not only have the same name, but their name reflects really the work of their lives. Joshua is instrumental in saving the people and delivering them, but only through the power of God. And Jesus, of course, is similar, although I think it's pretty easy to see that Jesus is greater, because the salvation and the deliverance that Jesus offers is of a spiritual and a permanent variety, whereas the salvation and deliverance that Joshua provided was really more physical. And as we see leading into the period of the Judges, it was a lot more limited in terms of its duration. Okay, good. Other connections, other similarities between Joshua and Jesus that you found? I was not aware of the second one that's listed on the chart there. Both of them are connected to or descended from Joseph's. Obviously, Jesus is pretty clear. His earthly father, not actual father, but his earthly father was Joseph. But Joshua was, in a sense, a son of Joseph as well. Not directly. Of course, does anybody remember who Joshua's dad was? This is one of those Bible trivia things that... Yeah, Joshua the son of Nun. Yeah, Joshua the son of Nun. So Joshua was from the tribe, though, of Ephraim, which was one of the two tribes that came from Joseph. Remember that Joseph, when the land was divided, because he was the favored son, his sons actually both got divisions of land, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so Joshua is of the tribe of Ephraim, which made him a son of Joseph as well. So they're both similar in that respect. What else? Other comparisons or similarities, Tanya?
Well, I took number 2 to be, they were neither one from the priestly tribe.
Okay, good.
Neither one was from the Levites.
Okay.
Christ was Judah, and then, of course, Joshua was Ephraim.
Okay, good. And that sort of puts, I hadn't really thought about this, but it puts Joshua in an interesting position when it comes to lineage, because so many of the key figures in Old Testament history, their tribal lineage is really significant, either because they're from Levi and so they're descendants of the priests, or they're from Judah or Benjamin in the case of Saul, and so they would have been part of tribes that had royal claims. But in the case of Ephraim, and therefore Joshua, you don't really have that. So that is interesting. And Jesus, of course, you have someone not from the tribe, or not from the Levitical order of priests, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, but somebody who is qualified to be a priest like Melchizedek. Very good. What else? Other points of comparison that you found interesting or important? Alan? Yes, sir.
Some of these are hard to correspond, but I wondered if I don't know if the author's point, what he's trying to connect, but on the C point, I thought that perhaps I was trying to point out that both of them are successors of Moses.
Good. I think that's exactly the idea. And that's fair enough. Some of these you may have been scratching your head about, and that's okay. And if you came up with an answer that differs from other people, that's fine too. But I think that's the idea. Both of them are identified in Scripture as successors of Moses. Joshua immediately succeeding him, and Jesus, of course, being the prophet like Moses that would come and speak to the people. Good. You have some similarities in terms of their actions, or some of the things that they were noted for, like miraculously. What were some of those? Bruce?
Power over nature.
Okay.
A couple of different instances. So.
Good. So one instance that's listed there is the crossing of the Jordan. So the waters, similar to Moses at the Red Sea, the waters divide and the people cross on dry land. Jesus, of course, crosses over the Sea of Galilee on top of the water, and so you have the performing of a miracle involving water there. And then also the performing of a miracle that involves nature in another sense. Joshua was the one who was in the battle with the Amorites, who appeals to God for the sun to stand still. Remember that? And so it does that for a time. God stops the sun, the movement of the sun, lengthening the day to allow Joshua and the Israelite armies to pursue the Amorites and completely overtake them. Jesus did similar miracles. Perhaps not the stopping of the sun, but in some ways you might contrast that with the sun being darkened at Jesus' crucifixion. Or you might compare that with something like what Jesus does when he calms the sea. So both of them involve kind of like a stilling of nature. All right, what else? Any other comparisons that you found between between Jesus and Joshua? Phil?
Numbers 14 says that they tried to stone Joshua.
Okay, good.
Because of their good attitude, and they didn't like what they had to say. Well, people tried to stone Jesus too. So.
Okay. Yeah, back when Joshua comes back with Caleb and they have a good report and they say, no, God told us we could take the land. It's a beautiful land. Yes, there are giants, but God's with us. The people tried to turn on them and stone them. And that's, I think, a theme of great significance, not just regarding Joshua and Jesus, but even Samuel, even Moses. So many of the Lord's appointed servants were rejected by the people. And that's one of the themes that carries throughout the Old Testament it's one of the key themes that Stephen mentions in his sermon in Acts chapter 7. He points out that the Jews of his day had done the same thing that their forefathers had done for centuries in rejecting repeatedly the ones that God continued to send to try to deliver the people. So whether that's Moses or Joshua or Samuel in some sense as well, you kind of have those repeated failures on the part of the people to accept the appointed leaders, the leaders that God appoints. Really quickly, before we shift gears to Samuel, I want to take a look at this last parallel between Jesus and Joshua and go over to Hebrews chapter 4. Because this is one of the things that when Joshua shows up in the New Testament, I think those are always places that we should pay attention to. Once we see these characters actually described in the New Testament, because the points that the writers are making, I think, are often points of great significance. So Hebrews chapter 4, we're going to read verse 6. We're going to start in verse 6 and we're going to read down through verse 11. Hebrews chapter 4, beginning in verse 6. The Hebrew writer says, "Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David, after so long a time, just as has been said before, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience." So what the Hebrew writer does here is pretty profound. He talks about the unbelieving generation of Israel that didn't receive rest because they doubted God. And then he fast forwards from the time of the wilderness and the time of the conquest to David, and a psalm that David writes, where David talks about not hardening your hearts like the unbelieving generation, so that you won't miss out on rest. And the point that the Hebrew writer makes is, if David is writing this psalm hundreds of years after Joshua led the people into Canaan, and David talks about entering rest and finding rest today, then what's the point of it? What's the implication? The implication is that the Israelites never got rest in Canaan, at least not the kind that God wanted to give them. And it was because of their unbelief. So David's point is, don't harden your heart like that generation. And the Hebrew writer builds on that and basically makes this point, listen, there's still a rest that awaits us. And so when you consider who he's writing to, we've talked about the Hebrew audience, the Hebrew Christians, people who were discouraged by different things that they were going through, people who had been persecuted and had suffered things because of their faith, people who were being tempted to go back to what they knew in Judaism. His point is, if you quit now, you're losing out. You're going to miss out on the best that God has to offer to you. There remains a rest for the people of God. And so we got to be diligent, though. If we want to enter into that rest, we got to be diligent. And if we fail and give way to a heart of unbelief, then what happened to Israel is going to be the same thing that happens to us. So in so many ways, Jesus is the kind of the ultimate fulfillment of Joshua, because he's the one who's leading us into our rest. But it's a better rest, and it's a perfect rest, and it's an eternal rest. Okay, anything else on Joshua before we shift gears and talk about Samuel? Okay, so Samuel comparisons, same kind of thing in the chart there. There's some references that hopefully gave you some guidance for where to look, or what comparisons to look for. What were some of the similarities that you found between Jesus and Samuel?
Certainly the relationship between them and their mothers, and how that developed over the years and stayed constant. even though each mother knew that I have this son, but it's not my child.
Good. Yeah, so both of them, the dynamic between parent and child, mother and child is very significant and very similar. Both of them involve situations where the mom is giving birth to a child that they know is dedicated to the Lord. This child is going to be special. The child's going to belong to the Lord. And so the mom has to deal with that. And the mom is supportive of that and understanding of what God is calling this child to. But there's also some difficulty that goes with that. Very good. By the way, along those lines, one of the things that's pointed out are the prayers of the moms in both of Hannah in 1 Samuel 2 and of Mary in Luke 1. If you read those prayers side by side, it is remarkable how similar they are. I mean, there are some things that both of them say that it's almost like, the words come from one mouth right into another. And so you see a lot of parallels there between the gratitude of these mothers for what God has done for them and the role he's allowed them to play, but an understanding of who this child is going to be and the limits of the mother's role moving forward as the child enters service to the Lord. All right, what are some other similarities that you found? Anything else that stands out to you? Carrie, yes.
So both seeking the Lord from an early age, being very, godly minded from an early age, and also being chosen to rebuke the former generations or to rebuke those that had been in power before. Okay, good.
So early on, what we get from Samuel and Jesus are some interesting things. We don't, when you think about a lot of Old Testament characters, we don't necessarily have a great deal of insight into their childhood and their early years in many cases. But Samuel and Jesus, we do. We know what it was like, at least glimpses of them growing up. Samuel growing up in the presence of Eli, helping him out in the tabernacle and around that area. And God working through that situation to call him. Jesus similarly growing in favor and wisdom and stature and being found in the temple at an early age too. But I also really like that second thing you mentioned, which is that God used them to speak judgment on religious leaders who had repeatedly failed in their duties or their leadership. So Samuel bringing judgment against Eli for his failure to rein in his sons. Jesus bringing judgment on a lot of the religious leaders and the scribes and Pharisees for their failure to lead the people. Very good. What are some other similarities, other points of comparison that you found? Stan? Yes, sir.
You've alluded to this, but they were both of them totally committed right from the start.
Okay.
To God.
Good. So dedication to the Lord, really from the womb, and dedication that they understood at a young age. It's interesting. You have even in that conversation that Jesus has with his parents when they come back to Jerusalem and find him in the temple. He says, don't you know that I had to be about my Father's business, that sort of thing. What do you remember about the call of Samuel at an early age? Like after he's taken and dedicated to the Lord and presented to Eli and he begins to serve in the tabernacle, what happens in Samuel's life, or what does he experience that kind of indicates that call that God gives him, not just from serving Eli, but actually being a servant of the Lord? Wayne?
Well, he thought he was freedom, and went to ask God, or thought it was Eli talking to him. He went to ask God, he'd done that 3 times, and then Eli said, well, you answered God, and God spoke to him.
Okay, good. Good. So you have this experience with Samuel at a young age where, as Wayne pointed out, He thinks that Eli's talking to him in his sleep, and Eli realizes that it's actually the Lord. So Eli tells him, when you hear this voice again, here's what you do. You say, "Speak, Lord, because your servant is listening." I think that, kind of in a nutshell, also reflects the attitude that Jesus had toward his Father. Both of them have this attitude that says, I'm here to listen to the Lord. Whatever he says, that's what I'm going to do. The Hebrew writer points that out elsewhere. He quotes from the Psalms that talk about Jesus saying, or the psalmist saying, "Sacrifice you didn't desire, but a body you've prepared for me, or my ears you have opened." And that kind of is the same idea that's reflected in Jesus, that he came at a time when so many people had closed their ears to the Lord, and he instead opened his. And whatever God told him to do, wherever God sent him, he was willing to do that. That's another thing. I think we talked about this, maybe we alluded to it, but both of them come on the scene. Alan, I think you pointed this out, where people hadn't really heard from the Lord with much frequency before that. As he pointed out in the days of Samuel, there weren't many words from the Lord. There weren't many people speaking frequently on his behalf compared to times past. Of course, in the days of Jesus, really up until the coming of John the Baptist, no one had spoken for the Lord legitimately for hundreds of years, since the close of the Old Testament. And so you both have these individuals who come on the scene at very important times, but their mindset is not to just show up and start talking. Their mindset is to listen to the Lord, and then whatever God says, that's what they're going to speak. So right away, we kind of get this picture of what it really means to have the mindset of a servant of God. It's to listen first and then to speak what God says. Yes, sir, Bruce.
You touched on this about finding favor, but as much as Mary and Hannah knew these children were special, the people around them could realize that these two boys were different. They were special, and so you see that from the outside, that people realize that there's something different about them.
Okay, good. Good. So in the cases of some, there's an appreciation for that because of the understanding that this is God's chosen spokesperson. In other cases, you have people who sort of resent that, which is interesting. Think about some times in both of their lives where they deal with rejection, or they deal with people kind of not, or like pushing back against their God-given authority. What were some of the cases in Samuel's life where that happened? Phil? Yes, sir.
When he asked for a king, he says he don't want a king.
Sure. Good.
Take my word for it. Yeah.
Good. So right away, kind of at the outset, when the people are asking for a king and they're pointing at all of the failures of the judges and Eli and things like that, it really is a rejection of the Lord. And he points that out to Samuel. He says, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. But there was an element of rejection towards Samuel as well, the one that God had appointed to lead the people and speak to them and judge them. And yet, what they were looking for was somebody that was more like the nations around them. Very good. Yes, Bruce.
And Samuel even has pushback from Saul, as
Right.
he anoints him, and then later he's got to stand up against, the things Saul's doing that's wrong. And so, that even is there as pushback.
Good. Yeah, in Saul, you have somebody that shows up and actually tries to, on some level, usurp Samuel's role. I mean, not only does he not listen to Samuel's counsel and advice, but when Samuel is going to offer a sacrifice leading up to a battle, and he doesn't show up in a certain time period, Saul takes the responsibility on himself and does something extremely foolish. So you have, in the case of Samuel, somebody who is rejected by the people. He's rejected by the king that he anoints and the king that he counsels. And then so it's no surprise that at the end of Saul's life, right before he dies in battle, when he wants to know what's going on, and he tries to go summon Samuel, who is dead at this point, Samuel says, "I'm not going to talk to you." Basically Samuel says, why are you trying to listen to me and get a word from me now? And the irony, of course, is that all through Samuel's life, Saul didn't do that, or when he received words from Samuel, he rejected them. And of course, with Jesus, you have all kinds of similar examples of him being rejected by the people, by the leaders, by his own family, by those that he grew up with. All kinds of illustrations of that. Very good. Carrie, yes?
Well, and you also, both Samuel and Jesus are people that looked at people's hearts rather than their outward appearance, right? So
Good.
that's when Samuel goes to pick the next king after Saul's just put up. He
Good.
talks about how man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. That's what Jesus was known for, was being able to discern that difference.
Good. And it's interesting that and I guess this will be a little bit of a segue to next week. In Samuel's case, the one that he appoints in looking at the heart is one who's after God's own heart, who's maybe one of the best parallels in the Old Testament to Jesus in King David. So both of them have that mindset to look beyond just the flesh and the way that people regard those that are great and significant. And of course, both of them are involved ultimately in the establishment of a kingship. As was pointed out, I think somebody mentioned that Samuel anointed the first two kings, Saul and David. In the case of Jesus, he brings in, he comes as a king and brings in a reign and a kingdom that is going to be perpetual and eternal. So both of them serve in significant places in those respects. Any other similarities that you came across between Jesus and Samuel? Alan, yes?
One I don't think was a point on the book, I just thought it was neither one of them started out as from priestly tribes, but both of them ended up being priests.
Good.
Because you look at 1 Samuel 1, you see that Elkanah was from Ephraim. But the usual practice was the firstborn, which Hannah would have been her firstborn son, that would have been sacrificed and been exempted from service. The firstborn were exempted from service because the Levites served. But in this case, her prayer was, I'm going to give him to the Lord. So even though he started out exempt, he became a priest.
Good.
And
Good.
of course, Jesus was not a priestly tribe either, and ended up being a priest. And of course, we got prophet and priest. Jesus is both. Not a king yet, because Samuel wasn't, because there wasn't a kingship, but the next thing closest to it was a judge. And of course, both of them, Jesus and Samuel, are judges.
Good. And that, again, is one of those things that points us to the ultimate greatness of Jesus. All through the Old Testament, you have glimpses of these great men, but they're limited in some ways in their roles. Some could be priests, some could be judges, some could be kings, some could be maybe two of those, but none of them were all of them. Maybe Melchizedek is the closest thing that you get to that. And that's where Jesus excels them all. He shows up and he's all of the above. He is a priest, he's a king, he's a judge, all of those things. And I don't know if this was said, but just to make sure it's out there, both of them were obviously miraculous births. In the case of Samuel, he's born to a woman in Hannah who had been barren for a long time. She prayed to God, and God allowed her to conceive. Mary, of course, was a virgin, and so Jesus' birth was miraculous in that regard. So both of them with similar origin stories in terms of miraculous births. All right, for the last few minutes, what I want to ask you to consider is a question that we try to ask each week, and that is, what is the significance for us of these similarities? Like, in other words, why does it matter to us that Jesus bears such strong similarities to Joshua and such strong similarities to Samuel? What are your thoughts on that? And this partly goes back to what we started the class talking about, the roles that these men played in the Old Testament narrative. But let's close with that this morning. Why are these comparisons significant, do you think, for us today? Bruce?
Well, it shows what happens when we don't follow what God's spokesmen tell us to do. And
Good.
you see those examples in the Old Testament, what happened to those people if they didn't follow that leadership.
Good. Yeah, so much of kind of the tragedy of those generations is that they didn't thrive in spite of having good leaders. I mean, you had someone like Moses, you had someone like Joshua, you had someone like Samuel. Obviously, they weren't perfect, but they're about as godly of men as you'll find on the page of the Old Testament. And yet, for all of that leadership that they provided and all the ways that God worked through them, kind of the shocking thing is how much the people fail by contrast. Like at a time when you got good leaders, we should really be doing well and thriving as a nation. But in the grand scheme of things, that really wasn't the case during the days of Joshua and Samuel. Obviously, Joshua, they come in, they conquer the land, but they didn't drive out all the people. In every territory, there are remnants of the Canaanites that are allowed to remain that end up perpetually causing problems. In the days of Samuel, you've got, again, everybody doing what was right in their own eyes. You've got calls for a king. You've got people that were becoming more and more like the nations around them in their desires and what they wanted. And so a lot of that comes about because of a failure to listen to the leaders that God appoints. Very good. Annie, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's just further proof that the plan is coming from the same source.
Good.
I mean,
Good.
if you've got the same person drawing out the plans all the way through, then it makes sense that they're going to be similar.
Good. And in all those cases, and I think this is another takeaway for us, sometimes if you try to put yourself in the shoes of the people in those days, sometimes I think that there is an element of unbelief that comes from like peer pressure or the failure of so many around us. And whenever we're kind of caught up in a generation like that, it can become really easy to just go along with that. But I think that part of the value of seeing how God uses these servants is that he always has a way of taking care of his people, even if they're in the minority, if there's just a willingness to listen to those that he appoints. And so I think the same thing should be true for us with Jesus in the world today. We look around, things can be really discouraging if we focus on the hardships that we encounter. And yet what God has given us in Jesus is a leader who's more than capable of overcoming the world. And if we follow him, then we will do the same. Any other thoughts about the significance of these comparisons this morning before we close? Okay. We are actually a few minutes early, and that has not happened at all this quarter, so I'm going to give you a few extra minutes, and we'll dismiss for this morning. Next week, we'll talk about Christ and David, so be ready for lesson 9 next week. Thanks, everybody.